This is the third part in a typographic hierarchy series, and what we've done so far is we've gone through the first two steps, the know your HTML, and in the previous one, we did the second step, getting the HTML right, and that's what you see here over on the right-hand side. So I'm going to delve down a little bit deeper. So now that we've done that, the next one is to style the text, and that's largely what this is going to be about. I will say that there's enough text, and these things can take enough time to properly fully go through. I may not style every piece of text in as full as I might do in a full production site. Before we get into that, the one little piece I did want to talk about in terms of the HTML is that sometimes when you go through all this markup phase, your HTML gets a little off. This is actually pretty good here in this case, but there's some things there. So there's another extension in brackets called Beautify, which you can also get through the extension manager. And with that one, you get this option here under Edit to beautify. You can also check off the thing that every time you save it will beautify it. Depends, some people like this better than others, so you may or may not want to start with that. So if you click Beautify, what that does is it goes in and it rearranges your HTML in a hierarchical way with indentation and things like that. So you kind of get a nice HTML organization of your page. This can also be good, I found too, that if you've missed a closing tag somewhere and other things, you often see it with this because things are not indented as you might have expected them to be indented. Okay, so where we are now is we have this text. Most importantly is we've added HTML elements and CSS classes in a consistent way in order to get our heading with the main title and date and location, and then in our schedule, which is our schedule title, and then each of the different pieces in here going as well. I'm going to redo my live development just because that one seemed to not work. So occasionally if you do what I did and move off and forth, it will go. So what should happen is when you click in an element here on the right, it should highlight it in live preview on the left. And occasionally it will break that connection if you do too many different things or go to other programs and come back. So we are now going to style the text. And some of the considerations here, we want to make sure the most important items stand out from the rest, that each different kind of content gets a different type of treatment. And that was the important part about having these classes and HTML elements here, is because if I don't have a different element around something, there's nothing to style. Right? So when we add our CSS styles, we have to style elements. And the same kind of content should get the same kind of treatment. For example here, right, these all are section titles. So the section titles all get the same class, so they can easily get the same treatment. And we will largely be styling based on the classes. Okay, so then we will start looking here at some typographic properties that we can do. But before we can do anything, we need a CSS file to style. So I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to, actually wait, let me cancel that out. So let's just close. I'm not going to save that. Generally, what's a little bit better practice, instead of just making your CSS file directly, I'm first going to create a new folder. So I right-clicked, I'm going to go to new folder and call it CSS. That's just the standard name to call it. And then I can right-click on that folder, create a new file, and this we can call style.css. So that's also just showing you another way to create a file. All right. Now, this style is not going to apply to anything as it is, because I haven't actually added it to the HTML, right? So let's say I want to, change the background color or whatever else. Once I add something, it's not going to be affected. So I'm just going to show you. We're going to do body. So there's background. I'm going to scroll down to background color. So this is a nice little helper if you can't remember what they are. And we will use these are the named colors. I'm going to show you in a minute how we'll, another way to do color. So that's great, but if I go now to back to my page, nothing has happened, right? Because what we need now is we need to apply that. So I'm actually going to go a split view here with a horizontal split. We'll put the style on the bottom. I just dragged it down there, and make that a little smaller by dragging this down. And we have our HTML at the top. So I need to add a link to this page. So use the link element, and I'll just do that again. If you just type the word link and hit tab, it'll expand it. And this is something that's true in general of brackets in most good text editors now. If your editor's not doing that, you might want to consider getting a different one. So if I hit any other one, H1, hit tab, it'll add your opening and closing elements. And it's really good to use just because it helps you prevent you from making mistakes. So link, tab, it adds in a rel style sheet. And the cool thing here is if I start typing the path, so I want to go to the CSS folder first. As soon as I hit one letter, I get a highlight here I can use, and then it's going to highlight the file name. So this helps you also prevent typing errors and making your file. And you notice as soon as I added that file, I now have my CSS applied. So now we can go through, and I'm going to even these out a little bit actually, and we can start applying styles to our page. And one of the first things we're going to look at, and so these typographic properties are things that we can use to differentiate these different types of text. And one of them is font. So one of the first things you often do is want to choose the font families you're going to use for your different types of text. And a very common way to do that is to differentiate between your titles and your normal text with two different fonts. So not just using the weight, style, color, and other ones that we'll talk about, but using two different fonts. If we go back to our CSS example, you can see here that they have one type of font here that they used for these titles, and then a different kind of font for the text there. And so this kind of separation between title, two fonts is a common way to do that. What I'm going to actually do here, and they actually have, I think, even another font at the top, is I'm going to choose three fonts, just to show you an example, to use one for the main title of the conference, Careers in Creative Arts, and let's go back to ours. So one for this, and then another font to use for these sort of titles here, and then another one for the standard text. And then we will use the other elements, such as font weight and the size and the style, color, line height, and so forth, to differentiate after that. This brings us to another thing that comes up for a lot of developers, which is, well, what fonts do I want to use? So I often look for inspiration by looking at other sites. One kind of site you can also go to that has its own pretty good typography and hierarchy there, it's another good place to look, is Typewolf. So what this page is typewolf.com/Google Fonts, and it's just showing some, in this author's opinion, the 40 best Google fonts. Now there's a lot more of these. This is a very opinionated thing, so you don't have to necessarily agree with him on all 40 of these. And the author here, sorry to give credit where credit's due, is Jeremiah Schoaf. Hope I'm saying your name right. But it's often good to just use to go off of. Now the other thing that you're going to want to take into account here is who's your target audience, what kind of feel are you going for, and so forth. So in addition to wanting to have, let's say, your title and body copy fonts look different, what exact fonts you use often depend on the content you're displaying, who you're displaying it for, and so forth, because different fonts, they say different things. So I looked around and actually used a couple here and did some, and I chose 3 fonts. And one of the nice things, I'm using Google Fonts here, by the way, because this is, web fonts have really come a long way. They're often the easiest, quickest way to get a custom font served. If you don't use Google Fonts, you have to rely on the fonts on people's computers, and they often aren't consistent and won't necessarily be as guaranteed for the look that you want. So where Google Fonts is a free way to do it, there's other services like Typecast, and Font Foundries themselves serve fonts. So there's a number of different ways you can get fonts. So this one, BioRhyme, we're going to use for the main title, the XR for our other titles, and then Rubik for the text. And so, okay, now that I found the fonts that I want to use, how do I use them? Oh, and by the way, this is a newly redesigned Google Fonts. If you haven't been to it for a while, it's actually very nice. They did a nice responsive redesign here, and so that you can sort of see it very nicely, how it looks and so forth. And use things, try them out. So I recommend sort of trolling around on here and looking at things as well. So now you could select the font by just clicking select this font here, but we want to select sort of 3 of them at once to use. So I'm just going to the main Google Fonts page, fonts.google.com, and here you can start typing in the fonts if you know what you want. So start typing in that bio rhyme. So I'm going to click the plus sign here to add that, and then change and start typing my XR. There we go. I'm going to click the plus on that one. And Rubik. There we are. And Rubik. Now, so I've added 3, and you may be able to see now at the bottom of the page here, it shows 3 families selected. So when I want to use those, I'm going to click on that, and it's going to pull up this little dialog window. So I could just go to embed right away, but first, before I embed, I want to make sure I get the weights that I want. So one of the other things we were looking at is weight. What's the weight of the font? And that's essentially how bold it is. If you go to Customize, it will let you choose for each of your fonts what weight you want. And this shows you a little preview of what that's like. So you see, remember our numbers go from 100 through 900, but on Google Fonts especially, but in general, you're not necessarily going to have the font designer design for all 9 of those weights. And so here we see a light one, that's 300, and black is 900. So when we check these off, that's the ones that Google will download, and so that's the number that we have to use when we use a font weight number. Now for Rubik, since that's my main text, I'm not going to just want regular. I want the italic because I might want italic, and I may want bold too. So often, like your body copy, you want often at least those 3. Some people may need bold, italic, but some version of a regular font and some version of a bold font and an italic. For the bio rhyme, I'm going to go with just the bold one. This is my main title. And then for XR, we are going to be, just for the fun of it, we'll be extra bold, just on that one. All right? So you should also sort of write down somewhere those. So I know that for the XR, it's 800, and for the BioRhyme, I have the 700 font weight I want to choose, and for Rubik, I have the 400, 400 italic, and 700 weights. Now you also see, though, if you know how to read the other next statement we're going to do, you'll be able to remember what you're loading as well. So now the other just thing to pay attention to a little bit here is the load time. Remember, when you use these fonts, they actually have to be loaded in by the browser. And so if moderate is okay, obviously in some ways you prefer less, faster load time. But if you start to get to really heavy, so for example, if I just started checking off these, a bunch of these here, you'll notice the load time goes as slow, and you kind of want to avoid that. So that's one of the reasons that you don't want to just check all these off and have them all, but you want to make some actual decisions about what you really need for your site. Once you're done with that, you go to Embed here, and there's 2 different ways to embed. So if you embed with the link version here, you basically just copy that, and then over in your HTML, you would add another link and put it in there. The other way you can do it, especially if you want to just have one style sheet and make things easier to move around, is you can use the import, and you don't need the style part there, actually. That's if you're going to be putting it on HTML. You can just take the import statement, and you can go to your CSS file. So we'll go back here, and we'll paste that into the top of the CSS file, and that will import all those fonts through a CSS. So we only have one link that we still need in our page. Oops, and it looks like I somehow managed to break my link tag up there. Okay, sorry. So there we are. Now we have some Google fonts installed, and you'll see here now you can see that the BioRhyme 800 font weight XR, sorry 700 XR 800 Rubik 400 400 italic and 700. So that's another way to look and remember which weights you actually imported. Okay, so let's go in now and start applying some of these. So I'm going to go a little bit against some of the other advice I've been doing, but just to show you how to do it if you don't have classes, ways that you can style things. But generally after this we'll use classes, and I probably would normally go back and change this to a class as well. So one way is if I'm styling that H1 tag, I might actually style it with a header H1 as my selector, just to make sure I'm styling just the H1s in the header. And so then I could say font family. All right, and then you're going to write the name of the font. So this one is BioRhyme. Now, if you can't remember or you're not sure what to do, Google also gives you suggestions on what to do. Right. So if you want, you can start with those. So, I could use that as a beginning and start with that, and go from there. It's good to know whether the font you have is a serif, a sans serif, display font, and so forth. And so this will often tell you that. Just if you don't remember, the first one is our name, right? So we use the name font. We can only use that name, or I'll show you over here on the right, because we imported that font. The other ones are other fonts you want to use. So normally what I would do is I'd look for a couple other fonts, or at least one other that I think might be on people's computers if they couldn't for some reason download this font, they could use it. But you also want to at least have a generic fallback. Those are serif, sans serif, display, actually the ones here that you see in categories in Google. These are the generic ones: serif, sans serif, display, handwriting, monospace, and those are the different generic types of fonts. Okay, so that's my BioRhyme. I'm adding that to the header, and if I go back to the page now, we should have it. All right, sorry, I didn't refresh there. I may have to redo this again. Okay, so now we have our careers in the creative arts in our font. Now also, I may want to differentiate it, as usual with my font size. So, going back, and so we're looking at all these different, tricks that we can use. So, font size. So I'm going to do it in M. This is a more responsive way to size your fonts than in pixels. So there we go. And then also I want to make sure I get my font weight here. And actually probably should have done that next of 700, just to make sure that it's applying the correct weight that I'm looking for. Right? And I could also decide I might want to choose a color as well. So in terms of color, another little hint, and I don't have time to go through a lot of color here, because really that's another whole part of your site and your graphic design is thinking about the colors throughout your site. But that is intimately tied into your typographic hierarchy, because you should be using colors from your palette for the site. So one little thing I like that helps me just get ideas for colors is using a little tool called Palette Tab. So when you open up a new tab in Chrome, it shows you a color palette from color levers, and with each color it gives you a font from Google Fonts. They're just sort of randomized in terms of which color palette it chooses and font. I'm actually going to use some colors from this one just to make it easy and show you. By the way, this is the PaletteTab.com talks a little bit about this tool and what's there. Just a discovery one. You don't always have to do what I'm doing here for time's sake to use exactly these palettes or whatever, but it's just a way to help spur the imagination. So let's just use this color for it. So I'm going to say here color, and it was F1, F1, C1. Okay. And so now we have, oh, sorry, that was actually, let me use that color for the background color. I'm going to use this nice red here for that, FF7474. All right, so I'm going to take that, FF. All right, so let's use that, and we'll change this background color here to that one, just so we stick in our color palette, and then let's take a look at that. Okay, so that's a lot better. All right, so now we have our careers in the creative arts, and we can do other things with it, but I want to move on to some of the other styling here. For now, I'm going to skip over the date and location, and we can get to our next one. So we have our article heading. So from here on, generally what I'm going to do is, instead of styling the HTML elements, I'm often going to start with just styling the classes. So article heading is this one here. Happens to be our H2, and so we can start to set things. So on this one, the font family I'm going to use is the XR. All right, and that's a serif font, and then we can change it to, and you notice it's already changing there. Font size, we'll just say 2.5 M, and you can show some. Actually, that's a little bit big. Let's just stick with 2M for now. There are ways of things called typographic scale that people often use to determine what their different font sizes are going to be. So if you type typographic scale, oops, sorry, I didn't spell scale right, into Google, but typescale.com is one where it will use various scales. So some of these are music scales. They also have the golden ratio scale and other ones like that help you choose your sizes based on that, and they give you sort of the M's that you can put it in to do these different things. So that's if you want your font sizes to be related to each other as well. So there's other different ways to choose that. I'm going, again, like I said, a little bit quickly here, so we're going to sort of move along and do that. So I have my article heading. I may also decide that I want that to be, a different color as well, or do something else there. So in this case, maybe I'll just this time choose the orange one. I think that was it. Yeah. All right. So basically, we're making different choices as to what we're doing as we're moving along and doing it. Now it starts to get interesting from this point. So these are a couple of our larger titles, but really where it starts to get more interesting is as we start to style these sections, because they all have the same classes. So as I start to add in a class to it, then that will affect multiple things at once. So let's do now with the section title. All right, and I'm going to pick something similar. I'm just going to, for the sake of time, copy this for a second, except we're going to change this to a smaller one. And also, with the XR, we want to, I should have before done the font weight, which is 800 in this case. Yeah, you notice, by the way, if you don't do one, it generally goes to whatever the default font weight is if you only loaded one. But if you had more than one font weight for that font, it might not be what you want. Okay. So we now have our section titles. If I wanted to further differentiate those from the page title of scheduling, I could choose, a different color or something else like that. I'm going to leave it for now just at a smaller size. Now you notice here that we typed this in all caps, but it's also possible, like, if someone didn't, but you did want them to be all caps, you can do that too. And so that goes to the case using text transform. You can do that to ensure that it is. So if someone, let's say here, we'll go back, in our conference opening, didn't use all uppercase, right? They just taped it in or gave it to you, right? They just did it like that, and you said, okay, well, I actually want that to be all uppercase. So you could say, well, section title, we could go to text transform, and then uppercase. And so now that forces it to be uppercase, whether it was or not in the text. So often it's good to keep those styles in there rather than rely on doing it this way. Also, the other problem with typing it like this into the HTML is if you want to change it later, you also have to change it. I mean, you can do it. You can change things to lowercase and capitalizes too. So there's a few other options. If I go back and hit delete the colon and hit it again, it can do that. So like, capitalize, it can do that, and there's other options as well. So, actually, sorry, I didn't mean to do full width. I was going to do something else. All right, sorry. So we might keep that with the section titles. Now we also have the rooms and the times and the presentation titles. All right, so those are a few other things that we want to style. So let's start to do those. What I'm going to do, and track title. So let's go first with track title. I'm going to sort of worry about these sessions here that do that. So track title. So on the track title, I'm going to move on the font family. And by the way, you can use Emmet here too. So if you start to remember these, like FF tab will give you font family. That's part of how Emmet comes. So often these have 2-letter abbreviations for most of these CSS properties. So we're going to use Rubik, but at the 700 weight in this case, or we could use the XR, but at a a lower one. So let's say let's do that. I guess we'll stick with this and then move it from the right. So I'll just copy this here. Keep that. All right, and keep the font weight, font size, except we're going to bring the font size down a lot. And maybe I want to de-emphasize these a little bit. So one way we can do is we talk about contrast with text. So right now it's big and it's bold, and so it stands out because it's heavy. And actually, I'm not super liking this font at this size, but we'll stick with it and go along anyway. So one way I can do that is make it more similar in color to the background. So especially if that's not necessarily what you want people to notice first, I might actually want them to notice the presentation title first, and then the track is a secondary one. You can lower the contrast. So I might use color here, and then start to pick something that's similar. If we're using systems like SAS and so forth, these are easier because you can do light and darken, and so forth. There's other ways to do it. Color here. There's a name and color picker. There's other things So I think that's actually a little bit too low of a contrast here. It's actually hard to see. Sometimes you can alleviate that, by the way, by bumping it up to be really big. So if you make it really large, you can do that. That's lovely, but we're not going to do that here. Let's just put it back to another one. I'm just going to choose this color. Okay. All right, so there we go. And now we're going to do something for the presentation title. All right, and so this font family, we're going to use the last one, Rubik, here, except at the bold weight. So Rubik, and that's a sans serif font. All right, font weight 700. Okay, and we might just decide that we want to keep that. We might want to make a slightly bigger font size. So this is another way to do it, even though it's the same size now as the track title, because they have different fonts. They actually, look different enough. All right, and we're going to go through in the spacing and stuff here in a minute too. But we're right now just sort of getting this down. All right, so now we want a room. So room. So I'm going to stick with Rubik for that. Except for this one, for room, I want it italicized, right? So if we go back here to some of the things we can do, that's the font style that we can use to make it italic. So we might make that italic as well. Also, I want to make sure I get my font weight in there just to make sure that that's set. So I'm just doing a 400, 400, and then the style is italic here. All right, so now we have that, and then we also, one of the last things we haven't done is we didn't do the time, and we, want to figure out how we're going to style the time. For now, we're going to do that, but let's just change it to 700. But we're going to make the size smaller. Okay. All right. So now a lot of we have a lot of this styled where you can see the different pieces of it. But what we want to do is go through and change the spacing on it a little bit. So the spacing part is an interesting issue because what happens is browsers by default add in spacing for different elements. So all these H1s, the paragraphs, and all these things get spacing added in. So often what people do is apply a reset or a normalize to it to take out the browser spacing so they can add in their own. I'm going to show here quickly a basic reset. All right, now Eric Meyer here as well has sort of like was the pioneer in this. Right, this is his original reset. All right, where it basically goes through all this and takes out all the margin and padding and border and moves the font to 100% and so forth. All right, and this one is, I think, from 2011. As I showed here, there's some people who have updated that. Oh, actually, no, this is just mentioning that 2011 updated reset. There's also another one that people called normalize. And what normalize does, and this is one of the most common ones, is it doesn't take out all of the spacing. It just tries to make it all the same across them. And this is also used by something else called HTML5 boilerplate, which has some sort of a basic blank page. You can look at this later and see what's happening, but it's just another way to start out without having to do this. One of the things I recommend when you're learning about type and design, like we are, is to try this reset because it takes out everything and it forces you to make decisions about it. So normalize there's nothing wrong with them. It's nice. They do make some decisions for you about spacing and things like that. Whereas this basically removes it all and then adds it. Some people don't like that because it means that you're both styling something to take away spacing and then adding it in later. And there's a point to that. But I think especially for learning purposes, it's good to have this. So the reset should come first. There's two ways to do it. One is to include it as a separate style sheet. The other one is to include it in this one. So if we wanted to do it as a separate style sheet, we would have to include that first, right? So if I added a new file, and I called it reset.css, I could paste this in, and so that's there. And then I just have to make sure that that reset was included before my other style. So I add the link, hit tab, go to CSS, go to reset, and add that in. So what you'll see there is that once you hit the reset, all of this spacing in here gets removed. And so now you have to make decisions as a designer about what space should I have where on the page. All right? And this will start to do, but this is also something that can take a while. We're already pretty far in, so I think I'm going to stop this and start it back up in another video just so that this one doesn't run too long.